Montana winters don't forgive mistakes. They expose them. Every shortcut, every thin wall, every bad assumption eventually shows itself when the temperature drops far enough. By the early 1970s, people in Flathead County thought they understood winter. They knew how to stack firewood, how to bank a stove overnight, how to sleep in coats and boots when the cold pushed past the walls. They believed suffering was part of survival, that waking every few hours to feed a fire was simply the price of living there. What they didn't realize was that they weren't fighting winter poorly because winter was unbeatable. They were fighting it wrong. For decades, builders in the valley followed the same formula. Wood frame houses with light insulation, stone or concrete basements poured thin, wood stoves placed in the living room, and constant fire as the only defense. When temperatures dropped below zero, heat poured out through walls and roofs faster than it could be replaced. Basements turned into cold sinks, pulling warmth downward and holding onto it like a thief. Metal structures were avoided entirely for living spaces. Everyone had seen what happened inside uninsulated steel buildings in winter. Condensation froze on the ribs. Moisture dripped, wood rotted, tools rusted. The verdict was unanimous. Metal was for equipment, not people. Stone was for foundations, not warmth. That belief went unchallenged until one man decided to question it. His name was Ray Hutchkins. He wasn't an architect or an engineer. He was a carpenter, a welder, and someone who paid close attention to what actually worked. Ray had framed houses through bitter winters and welded steel structures in open fields. He'd seen log homes that looked solid and traditional bleed heat like sieves. He'd stood in basements so cold they felt disconnected from the house above them. He'd watched families burn through cords of firewood and still shiver through January nights. And over time, he noticed something others ignored. The problem wasn't the cold outside. It was how heat was being handled inside. Heat, Ray understood, wasn't just about how much you produced. It was about where it went and how long it stayed. He noticed that thin walls lost heat quickly, but thick materials behaved differently. He noticed that earth, just a few feet below the surface, never froze the way air did. He noticed that massive objects warmed slowly but stayed warm long after a fire died. Stone didn't get warm fast, but once it didn't let go easily. And metal, despite its reputation, wasn't the enemy if you controlled moisture and airflow correctly. It was simply a shell. By the fall of 1972, Ray made a decision that would get him laughed at across the county. He decided to build a small home that combined two things everyone said should never be combined: a deep stone basement and a steel Quonset shell. To most people, it sounded like stacking two failures together. Stone basements were cold. Metal buildings sweated. Put them together and you'd freeze in a damp cave. Ray saw something else. He started with the basement. Instead of pouring a thin concrete wall and calling it a foundation, he dug 8 feet into the earth, down to where the temperature stayed stable year-round. The soil there didn't care if it was -30 outside. It hovered quietly between 48 and 52 degrees, day and night, winter and summer. That wasn't enough to heat a house on its own, but it was a powerful starting point. It meant the basement wouldn't be fighting the cold. It would be insulated by the earth itself. He built the basement walls from local sandstone, 2 feet thick. Each section weighed thousands of pounds. This wasn't decorative stone. It was mass. He left the floor as compacted earth instead of pouring concrete, avoiding a direct thermal bridge to the frozen surface. The basement wasn't designed to be a cold storage space. It was designed to be a thermal battery. At the center, Ray built a masonry heater. Not a metal stove that burned hot and fast, but a high-mass heater made from fire brick, with a long serpentine flue path. When wood burned inside it, the hot gases were forced to travel through channels inside the brick before exiting. Instead of sending heat up the chimney, the heater absorbed it. 70 to 80% of the fire's energy stayed inside the masonry. The heater warmed slowly, then radiated heat gently for nearly a full day after the fire went out. This was the first piece of the system. Burn once. Store the heat. Release it slowly. The second piece was the stone itself. The thick basement walls absorbed warmth from the heater and from the earth around them. They didn't spike in temperature. They didn't cool quickly either. Once charged, they stayed warm, releasing heat evenly into the space above. Ray wasn't trying to make the basement hot. He only brought it to the low 60s. That was intentional. Overheating the mass would waste energy. Keeping it moderately warm meant steady, efficient radiation upward into the living space. Then came the part everyone feared the most. Ray placed a surplus military Quonset hut directly on top of the stone walls. The curved steel ribs formed a continuous arch, strong, aerodynamic, and simple. Snow slid off instead of piling up. Wind flowed over it instead of tearing at corners. There were no roof trusses, no valleys, no complicated joints where heat could escape. Inside, Ray insulated the steel shell with 6 inches of fiberglass. He installed a vapor barrier on the warm side, sealing every seam. He paneled the interior with wood, creating a finished living space that never exposed metal to indoor air. Moisture couldn't reach the cold steel. Condensation had nowhere to form. Ventilation was deliberate. Small operable vents at each end allowed humid air from cooking and breathing to escape before it caused problems. Skylights at the peak of the arch captured low winter sun, adding passive heat during daylight hours. Warm air rose naturally. Cooler air sank toward the basement, where it was reheated by the stone. The winter of 1973 didn't just change how people talked about Ray's home. It changed how they thought about heat itself. Once the shock wore off, once the disbelief faded, a quieter realization settled in across the valley. The suffering everyone had accepted as normal wasn't inevitable. It was optional. And that idea was far more unsettling than the cold had ever been. In the weeks after the blizzard, people started paying attention to details they'd ignored for years. They noticed how quickly their houses cooled once the fire died. They noticed how cold crept up from basements, how floors stayed icy no matter how much wood they burned. They noticed how wind seemed to reach inside their walls, how snow piled against vertical surfaces and stayed there, pressing cold into the structure hour after hour. Winter wasn't just outside. It was embedded into the buildings themselves. Ray's home didn't behave like theirs. It didn't spike and crash. It didn't depend on constant attention. It held heat like something alive, breathing slowly, releasing warmth evenly. That difference forced a question no one wanted to ask before. If his home could do this, why couldn't theirs? Ray explained it the same way every time, calmly, without pride. He told them heat was expensive when you lost it quickly. He told them mass was insurance. He told them the earth was not their enemy. And he told them the worst thing you could do in a cold climate was rely on thin materials and active heating alone. People listened now. The first builders to change weren't the loudest critics. They were the quiet ones. The ones who'd struggled all winter and were tired of pretending it was normal. They didn't rebuild everything. They adapted pieces. A thicker foundation wall here. A masonry heater there. A south-facing window added where none had existed before. Small changes, but informed ones. One carpenter rerouted his stove flue through a brick wall before exiting, letting the masonry absorb heat. Another insulated the exterior of his stone foundation before backfilling, something no one had bothered with before. A farmer built a partial earth berm against the north wall of his house, cutting wind exposure by half. None of these people built exact copies of Ray's home, but all of them borrowed the same idea: store heat, don't chase it. What surprised many was how forgiving the system was. It didn't require perfection. Even partial thermal mass helped. Even modest earth sheltering mattered. Homes became quieter. Temperatures stabilized. Nights became easier. People slept through them for the first time in years. Ray noticed something else too. Summer, while everyone had focused on winter survival, his home behaved differently in July as well. When temperatures climbed into the 90s, neighbors opened windows and still sweated inside thin-walled houses that trapped heat like ovens. Ray's basement stayed cool. Air drawn up from below lowered interior temperatures naturally. The stone walls absorbed excess heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The same system that defeated winter softened summer, that surprised people even more. Comfort without fuel felt like cheating. By the mid-1970s, fuel prices were rising. Wood was harder to come by. Chainsaws and trucks cost money to run. People started calculating what winter actually cost them, not just in dollars, but in exhaustion. Ray's home had quietly proven that efficiency wasn't about sacrifice. It was about design. Some accused him of luck. A mild winter, maybe. But records showed otherwise. The winter of 1973 remained one of the coldest on record in the region. His house had been tested under the worst conditions possible. It didn't just survive. It performed. Others claimed it wouldn't last. That moisture would eventually appear. That metal would rust. That stone would cool over time. Years passed. None of it happened. The vapor barrier did its job. The stone stayed dry. The metal shell remained intact. Maintenance was minimal. There were no roof shingles to replace. No gutters to tear off in storms. No framing members warping from temperature swings. The simplicity of the structure turned out to be one of its strengths. Ray rarely spoke about pride, but there was satisfaction in watching assumptions fail. Not because people were wrong, but because they had been trapped by habit. Construction culture, he realized, was slow to change, not because it lacked intelligence, but because it relied on repetition. Builders built what they had built before. If it mostly worked, they accepted its flaws as unavoidable. Ray's home didn't fit into that cycle. It forced comparison. As the years passed, younger builders paid closer attention. They weren't as invested in tradition. They wanted results. They studied old masonry heater designs. They read about earth-sheltered homes in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. They learned that the principles Ray used weren't radical at all. They were ancient. Civilizations had always used mass before fuel was cheap. They had always sheltered from wind. They had always worked with the earth because they had no choice. Modern construction had abandoned those ideas for speed and convenience, not because they stopped working. Ray had quietly brought them back. By the early 1980s, energy efficiency became a national conversation. Insulation standards improved. Vapor barriers became standard practice. Passive solar design entered mainstream architecture. Many of the ideas Ray had applied intuitively were now being rediscovered academically. His home hadn't followed trends. It had anticipated them. Still, not everyone adopted the approach. Some preferred familiarity. Some didn't want a home that looked different. Some equated hardship with authenticity. But even among those people, attitudes softened. They no longer laughed. They no longer warned newcomers away. Ray's home became a landmark, not because it was strange, but because it worked. Ray himself aged quietly inside those stone walls. He burned wood once a day long after his neighbors installed oil furnaces and electric heaters. When power went out during storms, his home barely noticed. When fuel deliveries were delayed, he wasn't worried. The house asked little of him. It had been designed that way. Visitors still came from time to time. Some were curious. Some skeptical. Some desperate for answers after another brutal winter. Ray always told them the same thing. Don't copy the shape. Copy the thinking. Understand where your heat goes. Give it somewhere to stay. Protect it from wind. Let mass do the work. Stop fighting the environment and start using it. The stone basement and metal shell weren't the secret. The secret was respect for physics. Years later, long after Ray stopped building, his home still stood. The stone hadn't shifted. The shell hadn't failed. Winters came and went. Temperatures dropped. Snow piled up and slid away. Inside, the walls stayed warm. The air stayed still. The system kept doing what it had always done. 55 degrees warmer wasn't an accident. It wasn't luck. It was the result of understanding something simple that most people had forgotten. Heat wants to leave. If you let it, it will. If you give it mass, shelter, and time, it will stay. Ray didn't defeat winter by overpowering it. He outlasted it, and that is why his home mattered. By the time Ray reached his 60s, the house had stopped being a curiosity and started being a reference. People no longer came just to see if it worked. They came to understand why it still worked. Decades had passed since that winter of 1973, yet nothing about the structure suggested decline. The stone basement hadn't cooled over time the way skeptics once predicted. The metal shell hadn't become a condensation trap. The system didn't weaken. If anything, it improved, because thermal mass systems don't wear out the way mechanical ones do. They don't rely on moving parts, sensors, or constant intervention. They rely on patience. That patience showed itself every winter. Ray's routine never changed. One fire in the masonry heater, sometimes two during extreme cold, then nothing. The house did the rest. While newer homes bristled with equipment, blowers, thermostats, ducts, backup systems, Ray's relied on gravity, mass, and time. When storms knocked out power across the valley, his lights went dark, but the warmth stayed. He cooked on the stove if he had to. He read by lantern light. The house held. That reliability became its own kind of quiet wealth. People often misunderstand resilience. They think it means strength, force, resistance. In reality, it means stability. It means avoiding extremes. Ray's house never overheated and never froze. It existed in a narrow, comfortable band no matter what the weather did outside. That stability reduced stress on materials. Wood didn't expand and contract violently. Joints stayed tight. Finishes lasted longer. Moisture never had a chance to settle where it didn't belong. The building aged gracefully because it was never pushed hard. As years went on, Ray noticed something else others missed. The house changed how he experienced winter emotionally. Before, winter had meant vigilance. Watching the stove. listening for changes in wind, waking up to cold floors. Now it meant quiet. Long nights without interruption. Time spent reading, repairing tools, thinking. Winter no longer demanded constant attention. It became background instead of a threat. That psychological shift mattered. Visitors would sit inside on cold days and feel it. The absence of noise. No fans cycling on and off. No roaring fire demanding fuel. Just warmth radiating evenly from walls and floors. The house didn't shout. It whispered. That calm changed how people thought about comfort. They realized warmth didn't need to announce itself to be effective. The stone basement, in particular, continued to surprise people. Conventional wisdom still told them basements were liabilities. Cold. Damp. Unpleasant. Ray's basement felt like a cave that had been gently warmed by the sun. Not hot. Not cold. Stable. Children played down there. Tools didn't rust. Food stored well. Air smelled clean. That stability came from isolation, not exposure. The stone walls never touched frozen air. They touched earth. 8 feet of it. Earth that buffered temperature swings. Earth that ignored blizzards. Earth that quietly moderated everything above it. Modern builders eventually put names to these ideas. Thermal buffering. Earth coupling. Passive survivability. Ray never used those terms. He didn't need to. He understood the behavior even if he didn't label it. The energy crises of the late 1970s and early 1980s hit. Ray's home gained new relevance. Fuel prices spiked. Electricity became unreliable in rural areas. People panicked about dependence. Suddenly, the idea of a home that didn't need constant fuel sounded less strange and more necessary. Architects started talking about passive solar. Engineers talked about heat retention. Governments published efficiency guidelines. Ray watched it all with mild interest. To him, it wasn't new. It was just catching up. What many still missed, though, was integration. Ray's house didn't rely on a single trick. It wasn't just insulation. It wasn't just mass. It wasn't just shape. It was everything working together. Remove one piece and the system weakened. Add one piece without the others and results diminished. That's why copying the look without understanding the function often failed. Some people tried. A few built metal homes without proper vapor control and confirmed their worst fears. Others added stone without insulating it from the outside and complained it stayed cold. They blamed the materials instead of the execution. Ray would listen, nod, and say the same thing. Materials don't fail. Designs do. By the 1990s, Ray had become something of a quiet consultant without meaning to. He never charged. He never advertised. People just asked. He'd sketch diagrams on scrap paper. He'd point to where heat moved. He'd explain why thin walls were expensive over time. He'd remind them that wind was often a bigger enemy than temperature. Wind, especially, was something modern homes underestimated. Sharp corners. Tall walls. Roof lines that caught gusts like sails. Ray's curved shell deflected it all. Wind flowed over and around without pressure points. Snow slid off before it accumulated. The building didn't fight storms. It let them pass. That philosophy extended beyond construction. Ray believed effort should be placed where it mattered most. Dig deeper instead of burning more. Build thicker instead of working harder later. Invest once, then rest. His house reflected that mindset. It asked for thought up front and almost nothing afterward. As Ray aged, physical labor became harder. Splitting wood wasn't as easy as it once had been. But the house demanded less from him than any other home would have. He could fire the stove with smaller loads. He could skip days entirely during mild spells. The stone remembered the warmth even when he couldn't provide as much. That memory was the house's greatest feature. Thermal mass doesn't care who you are or how strong you feel that day. It doesn't forget. It doesn't rush. It holds what you give it and gives it back slowly, reliably. That made the house forgiving. It didn't punish missed routines. It didn't collapse under neglect. It supported its occupant instead of demanding constant service. When Ray eventually passed, the house didn't change. New occupants noticed the same things. Quiet warmth. Stable temperatures. Minimal fuel use. They didn't know all the details at first. They learned by living there. The house taught them that may be the most important legacy of all, not a design. Not a structure. But a lesson embedded in stone and steel. The lesson was simple. Comfort doesn't come from force. It comes from alignment. When your home aligns with climate, physics, and human needs, it stops being a machine you operate and becomes a shelter that works on your behalf. The stone basement and metal shell weren't opposites. They were partners. One slow and massive. The other light and protective. One anchored to the earth. The other shaped to the sky. Together, they created balance. 55 degrees warmer wasn't a miracle. It was the result of letting each material do what it does best and refusing to use it for anything else. In the end, Ray's home wasn't about surviving winter. It was about redefining what survival looked like. Not endurance. Not hardship. But understanding, and understanding, once built into stone, lasts longer than any storm.